to understand something like visual perception, you can't just look at what's happening in the brain. You have to take into consideration the structure of the environment and the whole body of the organism. And so, kind of in a nutshell, what is ecological psychology? It's an approach to perception first that says that the target of investigation for the psychologist is the whole organism environment system. It's interesting that cognitive psychology and cognitive science was born out of the 1950s, 1960s. What technology was really popular and becoming like, oh wow, this stuff is amazing around that time? Computers, right? And so it's like, wow, computers can do so many cool things. Maybe that's what our brains are. Our brains are computers, and there's a sort of seduction about that. And it's very common for, humans are very metaphorical thinkers, analogical thinkers. And if you look back throughout history, it's very curious that when humans have theorized about the mind, it's often tied with the technology of the time. So you go back to like ancient Rome, and there was discussion of the mind as an aqueduct, right? You go up until like, Leibniz's time, and windmills were really cool. And people thought about the mind as a kind of windmill, right? Processing, turning this and that. And then you go in the 20th century and you've got computers, right? What happened in the 1990s and 2000s? The internet appeared. How did people start thinking about the mind? Like a network, right? And so I think, Gibson's like, let's be cautious to not be seduced by, these technologies, which are very impressive and cool on their own. But let's not mix the metaphor with the reality. And let's try and think about the perceptual organism on its own turn.
What are the biggest academic interests that you've had throughout your career that have led you to the point of writing The Ecological Brain, which is a book that we'll talk quite a lot about?
Yeah. First, thank you, Evan, for the invite. I'm happy to be here and chatting about this work and hearing your interest in it as well. So I started as an English major, so writing and literature, and I ended up doing philosophy on the side as just kind of something that I thought was just kind of fun. And so I'm just really interested in, what is the mind? Right. And what is it like to be us, to be an organism in the world? And I found a nice connection between literature and philosophy in that, narratives are really important in how we think about what it's like to be in the world.
Right.
And so I found myself at this weird place where I thought philosophy of mind was really cool, right? It's like, it's the mind and body separate. Is the mind just the brain? All these kinds of interesting metaphysical questions. And so I started getting kind of frustrated with the way that the philosophical debates were going. And because part of the frustration was, it was, really based on, a lot of just like thought experiments and what's possible, right? And it's like, well, here's a thought experiment. Is it possible to be physically identical to who you are, but not to have consciousness?
Right.
And it's like, yeah, I guess, but how does that affect us now? And how does that inform our understanding of how brains work and things like that? So I started getting really interested in the sciences of the mind. And so, fast forward through various kind of life trajectories and things I did, I ended up going to graduate school at the University of Cincinnati, which had a really strong interdisciplinary program between, philosophy and the sciences. And so while I was there, I did a PhD in philosophy with a focus on the life sciences. And I concurrently did a graduate degree in experimental psychology as well, because I wanted to be able to say, like, I know what these science papers are talking about. And I also, I want to be able to do the work myself. So I throughout my, career, I've done both. I've done philosophy, but I've also done a combination of experimental psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, things like that. And so all of this, summary comes up to, this book, The Ecological Brain. And The Ecological Brain pretty much is a narrative. It's a story about how do you study the mind as something that is happening in the brain, but happening in the body as well, and happening in our interactions with other people, with tools in the world, and things like that. And so I think about science through a narrative perspective, right? So what is the story that we're trying to tell? Who are the characters, and things like that. And the characters here are concepts and theories and the different kinds of methods. And so, yeah, that's kind of, what brought me to writing this book.
Awesome. It's such an interesting trajectory to go at it from an English degree. I wonder what perspectives that gives you in science that a lot of scientists wouldn't have, having such a rigorous like physics or neuroscience background, and what theories they might develop and how they think about these things. I guess one of the next big labels to really understand then is, what is ecological psychology? So this is something that I will admit to my ignorance, I only actually discovered about a week ago, and I studied neuroscience. And I don't remember hearing this term, this label, this field a single time in my neuroscience degree. I had a cognitive psychology module, and I think a lot of the next while will be really teasing apart what the differences in those fields are. But let's start with, what is ecological psychology?
So you should not feel bad about not knowing what ecological psychology is, especially as a neuroscientist, because most psychologists don't know what ecological psychology is.
Right.
I think when you ask psychologists, do you know what ecological psychology is? They'll say something like, so that's to do with the ecology. So is it like environmental rights? Or they'll say things like, oh yeah, I read a study about how like people get angry if their room is painted red, right? That's ecological psychology, right? No, that is not the kind of ecological psychology that I'm talking about in the book.
Right.
So what I'm talking about is a tradition of doing experimental psychology, particularly perceptual psychology, originated in the mid-1900s by a man named James Gibson, and later developed as well by his spouse, Eleanor Gibson. And so one way to think about what ecological psychology is to think about what it's not. And so what it's not is, it's not your standard cognitive psychology. So the kind of stuff that you just mentioned. So let's go through an example. So how does visual perception work? It's standard cognitive psychology or perceptual psychology. Well, the way it works is, it says, well, you've got like a light source and it's emitting photons, and those photons bounce off of surfaces, and it hits your retina, and it goes, into the retinal cells and the optic nerve, all the way back into the, visual parts of the brain. But it's all just meaningless, like stimulation. And it takes this stimulation and it hits this two-dimensional set of cells in different kinds of ways. And then it's up to the brain to process that and give it meaning. So how do I know that this is a cup, which, by the way, is one of my favorite cups? It has Nietzsche on it. It's one of my favorite philosophers. How do I know that it's a cup and that I can drink from it and it's solid? Well, because I have a storage of, in my memory, in my brain, that says, well, things that are shaped that way, are meaningful in this kind of way, and it goes from this computations and all this stuff. And then how do I grab it? Well, then I send a motor program down into my arm, and I calculate torque and movement, and all this. So then I represent the cup, I represent my body, and all this stuff. I grab it and I hold it. Okay, so Gibson comes along and he says, that is just an incredible amount of computation that has to be happening in the brain, and it just is physiologically impossible. Right? The amount of computations that have to occur, right? And it's happening in real time. So what if we offload meaning into the world, put it back into the world? Don't just make meaning something that happens in brains that is the manipulation of meaningless sensory stimulation. So whenever a Gibsonian or ecological psychologist is talking about visual perception and how I can grab onto this, what I'm talking about is a alignment and attunement between the organism and the organism's sense of self with structured, meaningful information in the environment.
Right.
So there are lawful regularities in the way that surfaces reflect light. Organisms have been selected to be able to usefully tap into those lawful regularities. And so how do I know that this cup affords, so that's a big term in ecological psychology, affordances. How do I know this cup affords grasping? Well, my proprioception and my sense of my body while I'm moving and I'm perceiving this cup, and the light is changing, based on optics and flow and stuff like that. And as I'm moving towards it, I'm like, oh, I can grab that. So this cup is grabbable. The affordance literature likes to use the able at the end of words. So this is graspable. My chair is sit onable. The door behind me is walk throughable, right? If it affords that. And so Gibson shifted a lot of the work that happens in the brain in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience and things like that and said, you know what? Most organisms, including humans, probably don't do any of that. What they probably do is leverage the simulation in the environment in a real dynamic kind of way. And so to understand something like visual perception, you can't just look at what's happening in the brain. You have to take into consideration the structure of the environment and the whole body of the organism. And so, kind of in a nutshell, what is ecological psychology? It's an approach to perception first. People have developed it to be about other things, but primarily about perception, that says that the target of investigation for the psychologist is the whole organism environment system.
Right. That may
hope that helps.
No, it does. It makes a lot of sense. I think that no one would really disagree with the fact that it's incredibly important for the brain and for the body to understand its reciprocal, dynamic, chaotic relationship with the environment. What I sort of struggle with is, how do you do that test? What does an experimental apparatus or an experimental paradigm look like where you're trying to study the reciprocal relationship between those three systems? Because I guess something that cognitive science is good at, it's all about limiting down the variables and trying to control the system, right? And I think one of the things that ecological psychology would say about that, well, is you're limiting the variables. That data is sort of useless because it's not in an environment. But at least it's giving you an experimental paradigm, and it's giving you data within a system. What I don't understand is how you actually extract data out of this really complex relationship system. Like, what does a standard experiment in ecological psychology actually look like?
Yeah, so great question. So let me, so really it's like the history of the sciences, right?
Yeah, really. Right.
It what motivated people to do what they do. And so to answer your question, I think one helpful way is to think, how was Gibson first inspired to even think about things in this way? And he was a scientist, he was a researcher for the Army during World War II. And at the time, the Army was involved with pilots and bombers and things like that. And so one of his tasks was to train the bomber pilots how to land better. So landing was very difficult for
Fascinating.
a lot of the bombers, right? And so what he was doing, if he kind of took an anthropological approach, and he said, I want to listen to the bombers talk me through what they're doing when they land. And what he said, okay, so they're in the bomber and they're flying, and as they're approaching the runway, what they're focusing on is how the plane feels to them. They speed up and they kind of feel their body moving, with the plane, and they see the landing strip, and they see it kind of coming to them, right? It's kind of like there's this optic flow that's coming to them. And so as they speed up, the flow speeds up. As they slow down, the flow slows down. They pay attention to the movement of the runway and how it looks faster the closer they are, but the mountains move slow in the distance. And so what he said was, the bomber pilots are situating themselves in this large environment, and they're paying attention to cues in the environment, and they're relating their speed to the way that the information in the environment is presenting itself. So they slow down if the optic flow is too fast, and things like that. Why is that interesting? Well, Gibson was looking at all the educational manuals, all the training manuals, and the training manuals focused on none of this. What the training manuals were saying was, the pilots should picture themselves and the runway in an abstract kind of Cartesian coordinate system of absolute space. So there's this absolute kind of X, Y, Z coordinate system that the runway is a part of and that the plane's a part of. And so they should think about distance. Okay, so in that coordinate plane, how far are you? Okay, you're 1 kilometer from the landing strip. Okay, now adjust accordingly. And he said, organisms are not really like in the world thinking of themselves in this coordinate system. I don't think of myself as, a certain amount of millimeters from my cut. I think, can I reach for it? right? And so it's a distance that's reachable, not, oh, my arm is certain, centimeters long, or the cup is certain centimeters away, and so I'm going to adjust correctly.
Mhm.
So what does this have to do with doing experiments? Well, what Gibson pointed out and other ecological psychologists since then have really stressed is we need action scaled and body scaled units of measurement. So when an organism approaches, say, an aperture, like an opening, commonly a doorway is a common aperture, or if you're walking through a crowd and you need to get through two people, you want to go buy a beer, at the bar, there's two people there, you need to see if you can fit through them. That's an aperture. I don't say to myself, oh, the bar is, such and such millimeters away, and these two people are millimeters or centimeters apart, and my body is this and that. No, I think to myself, can I fit through it? Right. And that fitting is something that's measured in terms of maybe my shoulder width, but then also how my shoulders move around in the environment. And so when I say, how do people walk through various affordances, so various aperture openings, it's not just what is the width of the door and can you fit through that door? It's what is the width of the door in relation to my shoulder width, so body scale. But my shoulder width changes as I walk, so that's action scale. And so various ecological experiments will have things like, such and such person, if you have this shoulder width, there's a ratio that matters to what you can fit through or not. And so the variables that you measure are these ratios between, say, shoulder width and aperture openings. So you'll find things like, the average, participant has a ratio 1.3 from their shoulder to the door. And so it's not this absolute measurement, it's the relationship between the door's measurement and my own body features. So this like abstract kind of, Cartesian coordinate system type thing, absolute measurements like centimeters and things like that, they don't really play a big role in understanding affordances and how organisms perceive the world. It's more about what is the body in relation to the environment? What is the action in relation to the environment? And what is particularly interesting is that these ratios tend to be lawful. So regardless of your body size and aperture width, this ratio of say 1.3. So the door will always be a little bit bigger than the shoulder width. That holds whether you're a little toddler or a teenager, or you're really skinny or overweight, or really tall or really short. And so these ratios become really the kind of interesting target of investigation for a lot of ecological psychologists.
That's a really useful point, or a really easy way to put them into at least buckets where, so all conclusions or results from experiment in ecological psychology, they're all relational. They're not about absolute quantities. What I'm curious there is, why is it that relational quality, that computation isn't just happening on a subconscious level? Like when we're going through a door, we don't think, can my shoulders fit through that door? But it's always seemed to me, and this seems conducive with cognitive psychology, is that computation is happening on a lower level and we just don't perceive it. And we've done it so many times that concept has become automatic and that computation doesn't happen anymore. So is there any sense to that? Do you understand what I mean in terms of I'm not sure what you described there in that experiment is exclusive about ecological psychology. I understand the output is relational. That's interesting. But what couldn't be just a underlying computation happening within a framework of cognitive psychology?
Yeah. So, really great question. Really great point. So the question I think from the cognitive psychologist is, and this is kind of interpreting, what you're saying is, so why don't I represent the door width? And I have a representation of my body, right? So you've got your soma sensory cortex representing, you could say, my feet are here, my head's here, and so then I have a representation of that, representation of the door. I compute the relationship, and then I feed the motor program to my body that then tells me I can walk through that or not.
Right.
So what I think, is that possible that that's happening? For an ecological psychologist, I think they might say, yes, it's possible.
Okay.
Is it needed, though? And is it common across species? So one thing to keep in mind is that Gibson, actually two things to keep in mind. One is Gibson was aiming to do a psychology about perception full stop. So what is the nature of perception? Not just human perception, but what is perception for an ant, for a cat, for a bird, for an octopus, and for you and me and chimps, right? What would be the features of an organism and an environment that would facilitate perception for all those creatures? With that said, we want to then connect what humans do evolutionarily with what other organisms do. So Gibson was a good Darwinian, right? He wanted to make sure his story connected with natural selection, evolutionary theory. And if you think about it, you've got an ant, and an ant can perceive whether something is climbable or pass-throughable, yet it has a super simple nervous system. Consider something even more simple, a C. elegans, little tiny worm which has 302 neurons.
Right.
It can navigate the environment. Are we saying that the C. elegans is generating representations of its body, representations of the environment, and then computing those things in real time with 302 neurons? It's a tough sell. It's easier to say with us because we have, 86 billion neurons with trillions of connections, right? Like we just have this, it's like a supercomputer in there. So it kind of makes more sense that we would be able to do those computations. But hey, a C. elegans, an ant can do these things without that, rich computational kind of power. So could humans be representing the environment and then computing it in order to guide intelligent behavior? Yeah, probably in a lot of cases too, But is it necessary? And is it what we do? Is it how we learn? So Gibson's wife, Eleanor Gibson, was a developmental psychologist, and she applied a lot of these lessons to understanding stages of developments from, newborns to toddlers and things like that. So, and so this, you got to kind of take the whole framework as one big, piece. Affordances, connection with natural selection, does it connect, as I understand my ability to perceive affordances, can I apply that theory to an ant, a dog, a chimp, and things like that? So we want this whole kind of unified story. So there's a sort of sense of simplicity that's kind of appealing, as well. I'm curious what you think of that response on being as a cognitive psychologist or something like that.
I like the example you gave. I think I could, I would argue a little bit back that, just because that's the way the nematode represents their world doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that we do, although I understand the evolutionary argument. Is the main point there, I guess, that, having these internal models of our external world is our way that we could do it, but evolution would have picked the lazy option, which is actually an easier one, which is not doing all of that computation, but actually there's some other neat trick that's happening that I guess ecological psychologists don't really understand either, but it's in some sort of direct relationship between the environment and the brain, where that solution will be favorable by evolution because it's energy conservative. Is that sort of the why over time evolution might favor that option? Is that sort of the argument?
I think that plays a big part of it. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that it's the lazy approach. I'd say it's the efficient approach.
Right.
So, but laziness is often the product of efficiency, or is it vice versa? Efficiency is the product of laziness.
Yeah.
So I would agree, with that. So, to step on to another field. So in robotics, so I don't know if you know the roboticist, Rodney Brooks.
Actually, it just came up in a book. I have Max Bennett on the podcast next week. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but he wrote an incredible book called The Brief History of Intelligence that I'm reading at the moment. And he happened to come in at the start that his early robotics were ridiculously bad at doing the things that humans are very good at, and they were, good at doing what we're bad at. So briefly in the last week, I've just come in contact with him for the first time.
Great timing. So Brooks was actually heavily influenced by ecological psychology. So in the 80s and 90s, he was trying to develop robots to do simple things. As you were saying, it's really hard to do the simple things. And he was like, why? Like, the second we introduce one extra variable, right? So the robot's arm, moving forward and back, like, okay, that's, one variable. The second has to go up and down. It's like the computations become exponentially more complicated and they require an exponential more amount of computational power. And so he said, to get a robot to perceive the world and move around in the world, it's just, we can't, like the computations that are required, it's just like it blows up really fast. And so I guess, now I'm doing kind of theory of mind stuff. I guess like, one day he's thinking, he's like, wait a minute, here's the problem. We're trying to get the robots to represent the world and itself in its own kind of central processing unit, and then manipulating those representations. What if the robot doesn't do any of that? What if the robot just directly perceives the environment? And he has this quote that says, the world is its, best model, right? Why model the world internally when you could just perceive it directly? And from that point, there was an explosion in his, successes with these robots. They were able to, grab cups faster. They were able to navigate rooms better and, solve all these problems and things like that by offloading onto the environment what roboticists and cognitive psychologists and people thought you had to have done internally.
So was that true? What technological change was that then? Instead, to offload that to the environment, what did those robots do differently? That was sensors that was directly receiving the world, or how? What was the difference in those two robots?
Yeah, so you have one robot that perceives, and this is the same story I gave earlier about, visual perception, right? So you have some robots that, they have a camera that picks up, light, and then it has to, process the structure and create an image in its mind of the cup and itself, and then coordinate those things. That's the earlier robots that were having difficulty doing anything but the most simplest of tasks. The later robots, the ones that the Gibsonian robots, I'll call them, had a sense of their body in relation to the world and were in real time kind of picking up the features of the cup without representing it. So it didn't have to construct internally a picture of the cup, but as it's in real time, its arm is moving around the cup, it's detecting its features, its size, and its angle. So those features, those sizes, those angles would, in the previous robots, have to be constructed internally and then manipulated in an internal world before the body could do anything in the real world. But the later robots, the Gibsonian robots, would do that in real time, perceiving the cup directly without constructing an image in its own mind.
So the thing that I'm curious about here that I'm not sure I'm fully grasping is what when the robot is perceiving the world in real time, receiving that feedback, and it's adjusting its calculations and movement based on that data very quickly and dynamically back and forth all the time. On a purely technological point, how is that different than the storing of the information, forming the internal model? Like, what is happening in the robot when it's receiving that information and responding to it without creating this model of the world, if you understand what I mean?
Yeah. So I'm not a roboticist.
Yeah, right. That's okay.
From what I've read as a novice in making connections with the type of stuff that I do, it's more feature based, right, as opposed to holistic, I would say. So in real time, it's detecting size and angle as opposed to having to construct the whole thing in the mind, right?
Okay.
So
It's less holistic. It's sort of bit by bit.
yeah.
Okay. So where are the other fundamental, where the rubber meets the road for, where these two fields really collide? Would ecological psychologists say, would they disprove internal models at all for representing any information about the world?
So, with my philosopher hat on, I'd say, well, you've said a lot of words. I want to know what you mean by those words, right? And so that's kind of like the cheap way out. But a charitable interpretation of what you'd said, I think. So it depends on how hardcore of an ecological psychologist you want to be. So some are strictly anti-representationalist and explicitly so. So during one of my classes, when I was learning about ecological psychology, one of my professors, we walked into class and he had a tombstone drawn on the board, and it said representations. And we all came in and sat down, and he said, "This is the place where representations come to die." Right? Like, so they are like, no representations at all. Then you've got other people who are less orthodox, I'd say, and they'll say things like, well, maybe not, you don't need representations for, kind of basic perceptual things, but maybe for, imagination, abstract mathematical problem solving, you need representations. But there are all, and then some say, well, even the basic perceptual capabilities might involve some kind of representation. So some ecological psychologists have talked about ecological representations, what that would mean. So it kind of depends on what your commitments are and, how you use these terms. But we want to come back and say, why was Gibson motivated to be anti-representationalist? And there's a lot of things that are tied into that. One is, to repeat a point I said earlier, we want to make human perception continuous with the rest of the animal world. So what would a theory of perception full stop look like for humans, chimps, dogs, ants, etc., right? We also want to think, do we have to think about minds in terms of the hot technology of the day, right? So, it's interesting that cognitive psychology and cognitive science was born out of the, 1950s, 1960s. What technology was really popular and becoming like, oh, wow, this stuff is amazing around that time? Computers, right? And so it's like, wow, computers can do so many cool things. Maybe that's what our brains are. Our brains are computers. And there's a sort of seduction about that. And it's very common. Humans are very metaphorical thinkers and analogical thinkers. And if you look back throughout history, it's very curious that when humans have theorized about the mind, it's often tied with the technology of the time. So you go back to like ancient Rome, and there was discussion of the mind as an aqueduct, right? You go up until like, Leibniz's time, and windmills were really cool. And people thought about the mind as a kind of windmill, right? Processing, turning, this and that. And then you go in the 20th century and you've got computers, right? What happened in the 1990s and 2000s? The internet appeared. How did people start thinking about the mind? Like a network, right? Like, and so I think, Gibson's like, let's be cautious to not be seduced by, these technologies, which are very impressive and cool on their own. And maybe we do have some similarities to them literally, and maybe we have some similarities metaphorically. But let's not mix the metaphor with the reality, and let's try and think about the perceptual organism on its own terms.
So how might ecological psychology think about things like perception? Because I know there's a very specific definition of perception. So let's dive into exactly what ecological psychology, how it defines perception, and maybe where that differs from a standard cognitive psychological approach.
Yeah, so a fun starting point is to say that perception is not a word that can really be understood without action. So perception will always be written like perception-action, or perception/action, or they'll talk about the perception-action loop. There's this common kind of diagram in a lot of early ecological psychology writings. So when an ecological psychologist talks about perception, it's always in relation to an action and vice versa. Action is always tied to perception. So what were perceptual capacities evolved for? What were they selected for guiding action? Well, how do actions work? Well, they're always tied with some kind of perception, right? And so to understand vision, it always has to be not just its own kind of carved off modality. It always has to be vision tied to the movement of the eye, the movement of the body, the optic flow in the environment, right? All these things are connected. So this is quite contrary to your standard cognitive psychology, to your standard kind of neuroscience. And what's interesting is if you look at how cognitive psychologists break down their ontology, so the ontology is basically the different categories of the world, it tends to line up with the original categories that William James, the father of psychology in North America, the way he broke down these categories. So in his epic collection, the Principles of Psychology, he talks about this visual modality, the auditory modality, olfaction, right, different things like that. And then there's action, the different kinds of actions and stuff, and they're all like kind of isolated different phenomena. When you look at, what's funny is that when you look at the Society for Neuroscience and how they break down the different kind of talks and poster sessions, and you see this when you go to the Society for Neuroscience and you submit a paper. I don't know if you've ever submitted anything to the Society for Neuroscience, but it'll say, what category are you submitting this to?
Yeah.
Right. Those line up with what William James said, 120 years ago. It's still like there's the vision section, there's, the auditory section, there's, the motor control section, but they don't overlap, right? And this is an interesting kind of illustration of the way that the ontologies are viewed as drastically different between the ecological psychologist, which says you can't talk about vision meaningfully if you don't talk about the action that it's, imbued with, compared to the cognitive psychologist and neuroscientist, which says, these are kind of different kinds of modalities. And in the brain, there might be areas for these things. Abstractly in the mind, there might be these kind of modules, right? A module for vision perception, a module for motor coordination. And then really it's about understanding how do those two modules communicate. For the ecological psychologists, they'd say those modules cannot be really separated, right?
Right.
They are so intertwined and interconnected. It doesn't really make sense other than for exposition to talk about them differently. Does that make sense? Does that draw that?
Yeah. I'm really trying to get them in concrete buckets because it's difficult. And I know, and like, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of ambiguity between them. You've said the word meaning a couple of times, and I'm going to put my philosophical hat on and say, like, what do you exactly mean by meaning?
Yeah. So that's one of these tricky words that I've been kind of, sliding around.
Yeah, because every time you say it, I'm like, that sort of, the way he used it the second time is slightly different in my head than the way he used it the first time. So I want to get a clear idea of what you actually mean by meaning.
Yeah, so let's talk about in the case of being able to do something in the world. So, making this cup, graspable for me and be able to drink from it, right? The story I told earlier about this kind of, and all of it kind of, caricatured, simple cognitive psychologist, perceptual neuroscience approach is like, well, the world has like, there's all this like energy bouncing around. And I don't mean energy like, metaphysical energies, crystal healing, power animals,
right,
connected to the cosmos. No, I mean, literally like the stuff that physics studies, right? There's photons bouncing around and sound waves and stuff like that. That's what I mean by energies, right? For the, kind of more standard picture, the cognitive psychologist kind of picture, this is just like, it's just light bouncing everywhere. And some of it hits my eye and it hits my retina. And my retina is only, 2 dimensions, yet the world is 3-dimensional. So what's the, processing that happens in the world to turn that 2-dimensional picture, that 2-dimensional stimulation into something more 3-dimensionally meaningful? And by meaningful, in that case, I mean, rich enough to be informative, to guide action.
Right.
And so for the ecological psychologist, what is meaningful? What is rich enough to guide action? That's what we mean by meaningful in this case, right? Things you can do stuff with. So it's meaningful to me because I can do something with it. That's, essentially what affordances are. They're opportunities to do things in the world. And that's the source of meaning for the ecological psychologist. So they're offloading meaning from what just the brain is supposed to be doing to this real-time dynamic animal organism interaction. That's where meaning or the opportunity to do things arises from, as opposed to the standard picture, which says that meaning, how you can find that the environment allows you to do stuff. It's just a neural kind of computation event. So for the latter, the cognitive psychologist, meaning is something that is stored in brains, right? I've got all these different kinds of rules of perception. And this is something that David Marr had a big influence on cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience. So David Marr, for you or your listeners, he was a perceptual cognitive scientist, neuroscientist, and he was trying to understand how we can interact with a three-dimensional world based on a two-dimensional image in our eyes. And so he started thinking, well, the world is too impoverished with the energy that it imbues us with. So in order to make that impoverished data, to enrich it, we must have certain rules in our mind. And so one kind of classic example is when I look around an office and I look in the corner, and you can do this too. When you look in the corner, you see that there are these lines that go down and then they go out this way.
Mm-hmm.
That is a cue that I have that says that it is deep, that there's depth there.
Right.
Now, if the angle was down and then the top lines went downward, that would tell me that it's protruding, right? And that kind of simple difference in the top lines is something that Marr and other cognitive psychologists would say, it's not necessarily, well, let me put it another way. The idea to recognize that those could be cues for depth or not is something that would have to be like kind of internal and innate. And so that's how we turn this two-dimensional image of a line going that way or a line going this way, right? That's something that gets meaning based on this kind of rules that I have in my mind. And it enriches that impoverished stimulation in the world. For Gibson, the ecological psychologists, they'd say those lines are only meaningful because they appear as lines in those directions because of the way I'm moving, right? That's the only way we can tell. So I'm not sure if that's getting at.
So why does that necessarily have to be innate rather than learned? As in, maybe at the age of 6 months, I looked up, saw that arbitrary light signal, photons bashing my retinas, my visual cortex doesn't know which direction it's protruding. I extend my hand. Oh, okay, it's that way. That's a learned concept, and I now connect with that pattern of photons and that three-dimensional structure. Is that not a learned concept rather than some innate mechanism?
So for the ecological psychologists, I think they would certainly lean towards it being more of a learned concept. And the cognitive psychologist, it would be more innate. So this idea of the impoverished stimulation in vision, it has analogs in language as well. So Noam Chomsky, one of his classic critiques of behaviorism was that behaviorism leans too much on the kind of stimulation and exposure and learning that a child would need in a short amount of time to pick up these very rich language capabilities. And people like Chomsky and Jerry Fodor, they said, well, that's just not going to happen. A child learns to speak almost an infinite combination of words and sentences in a few years of life. But there's no way they could have gotten that from the stimulation that they were hearing their parents talk or watching TV. So where does it come from? Those rules must be innate. They must already be there. And so that's the language version of the visual perception version.
Yeah.
But again, I think the ecological psychologist would agree that, there's a lot of learning. And let me, put a little footnote on that. What do we mean by the time scale of learning? So the time scale of learning could be, a child from birth to, being a toddler to being a 6-year-old, et cetera. But it can also be the timeline of species, right? The timelines of natural selection as well play, a role in what is learned for an organism.
Why do you think the field of ecological psychology isn't more known? Why do you think it isn't taught in psychology classes across the world and in neuroscience lectures? Like, why is it not a framework that we learn about and that we use on a daily basis for understanding mind and body?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a really good question, and let me say, I think it's out there more than we tend to appreciate. And here's one reason why I say that. I was reading this paper, and it was in a computer science venue, and the paper was saying, um, did you, this is a recent paper, we're in the year 2024. This is a recent paper, and it said, wow, we've been using the term affordances in the computer science literature, and people tend to cite other computer scientists. But did you know that that term actually comes from some guy named James Gibson, who was a psychologist in the 1950s, that that's where the term came from? We thought we made it up, right? And so I think it's actually kind of, it's had its influence, and it's out there, but maybe not by name.
Okay.
Let's cut up one little part. But to get more specifically to your point, well, why is it not explicitly out there taught and learned? I think there's two main reasons. One is more kind of sociological, and I think, so how does science work, right? And science works by having, it's really strongly based on this mentor-mentee kind of system, right? So you go and you work in a lab and you learn from a mentor. And they teach you how to do the experiments. They teach you the words to use, the analyses. Then you go on and you start your own lab and you teach your students, right, the words to use, the techniques to use. And then you all publish in the same journals, and the journals know what the words mean in a certain way. And then those become like textbooks, and those textbooks end up, in high school and this and that. And so it becomes a strongly like sociological phenomenon about why a science is what it is. This becomes a numbers game, right? And what kind of departments exploded, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s was cognitive psychology. Programs exploded with the popularity of computers. A lot of funding from the government and military facilitated a lot of this work. Ecological psychologists, just numbers wise, didn't have as many institutions to have students to spread these ideas around. So it's kind of, that kind of sociological issue. There's also another theoretical issue, which is we are very much a computational society, right? We talk about things in computer terms. We use computers all the time. I'm on a computer right now talking with you. During class, working with, students, and they'll use computational words. They're like, I couldn't process what you were saying. They talk about themselves in this way. It's out there, right? But thinking about things like, well, the affordance of what you're saying is, I'm not tapping into it in real time dynamics. Like, that's just not a way that the kids talk, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So I think that's why. I don't think it has anything to do with like its scientific chops, because it's right up there, being reputable, being replicable, being, rigorous, being theoretically sound, so it has all the virtues that the other sciences have. I just think it's been a socio-historical contingency why it hasn't caught on.
Interesting. Let's dive into that. What are the best sort of seminal empirical experiments that really sort of where those pillars of ecological psychology are derived? Like, what are those, those bedrock experiments that really sort of indicate this as a good theory?
Yeah. So in the 80s, there started becoming this more kind of, what I'll say, more kind of rigorous, quantifiable ecological psychology. And so there are people like Bill Warren and William Wang, and these people, they started developing these methods of, the action scaled and the body scaled way of doing things. And so there are these papers in the 80s on stair climbing. So understanding the ratio between like leg length, rising capability, step length, how this ratio, connected. So the step on ability of stairs. This was a seminal paper in the 80s. And there were others on the pass-through ability of apertures. So again, I mentioned that earlier. So the opening, relation, body scaled, action scaled. So in the 80s, a lot of these different affordances started becoming quantified via these, action and body scale kinds of metrics. Another thing that started happening in the 80s with ecological psychology was a marrying between the experimental approach and the data analytic approach from dynamical systems theory. So dynamical systems theory, in short, we get this from physics. It's just the measuring of how things change over time in various ways. It could be how it temporally changes. So maybe how many times you tap your finger, to keep track with a metronome or something like that. But it can also, measure movements in time. So, how a head sways over time and things like that. This approach got wedded with the ecological approach in the 80s and 90s as well. So there's a lot of papers by Michael Turvey, Claudia Corello. These kind of people were bringing this together. So that was the main kind of seminal work that was done in the 80s to bring it in ecological psychology into a quantifiable, a rigorous quantifiable science.
So is your and correct me if anything I say here is incorrect, is this a very philosophical stance that, frameworks are useful because we can kind of poke at them and see what comes out? We can put something in and see what it spits out. It's like a function. And for that reason, cognitive psychology has been very empirical, very, very useful for thinking about the brain and mind as a conceptual framework. You're essentially arguing that a much more superior way, or maybe even just slightly superior way of thinking about the mind, body, consciousness, I know those are a lot of words, is in the interaction between the mind, body, and environment. So it's more of a philosophical stance. We would get better answers for our questions if we were to, better postulate our questions in reference to that more complicated system. Is that sort of in line with your take, or ecological psychology's take?
So in short, the answer is yes.
Okay.
To elaborate a little bit more, so I'm primarily a philosopher, and primarily a philosopher of science, so history and philosophy of science. And so from that perspective, I don't think that there is any science that's done that is not based at a minimum implicitly on philosophical assumptions. So, take, neuroscience, standard neuroscience work, this idea of, you damage a part of the brain and then you lose a particular function, right? This idea of like localization and decomposition. It says mind is identical with a physical substrate, the brain, and it is structured in an isolatable kind of way. We knock out a part of the brain, around here, and then someone can't talk or understand language anymore. We've got a commitment to the idea that we can carve nature at its joints, right? These are philosophical assumptions. And so ecological psychology, just like cognitive psychology, just like neuroscience, has its philosophical assumptions. Even if practitioners don't really have to worry about it all that often, and nor should they. Your average kind of, person in the lab, working with a pipette, testing, the genetic features of a certain, like Alzheimer's or something like that. Do they have to worry if the external world is real? Do they have to worry if physicalism is true or dualism is true? No, they don't have to worry about that. Do they have to worry about, is causation real? Or is it just something in the mind? Okay, it just doesn't even matter. And they shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Right? Like they need to be curing diseases, right? And they need to be getting grants and getting their degrees and a job, right? But for the philosopher and for the philosophically minded scientist, that stuff is important to think about. And, to that end, I think one thing I found attractive about ecological psychology as a discipline, as a field, was the practitioners have commonly been very sensitive to the history of their discipline and its comparison to other ways of doing that work. So, I would just throw money down that you take your average person trained in ecological psychology or your average person trained in perceptual neuroscience. I would say the ecological psychologist is far more aware of the history of their discipline and its kind of theoretical commitments than your average kind of perceptual neuroscientist. I don't say that in a way to say because they're better than the other one. In a way, they've kind of had to learn those things. They've had to learn. Well, if I'm being trained in ecological psychology, why is it that all my friends, out of 9 out of 10 other universities that they're at, they're not learning this stuff? Why? Well, it's kind of on the ecological psychologist to say well, let me tell you why. Let me tell you why these things haven't caught on, or why we think differently. And this requires going back to James and Darwin and kind of, the stuff like that. So I think, kind of socio-historically, ecological psychologists had to think about the philosophical aspects of their work more than other disciplines have had to.
There's something that's a bit strange there to me, in that that sounds awful like a religion. In that, you're kind of taking a lot of things on faith canon that doesn't seem to be changing. My idea of science is this, always warping, always shifting thing that is useful for testing things about the world. And we're constantly adjusting our models of how things work. And, a lot of what we currently think today as correct is going to eventually be wrong. But that's science. It's always shifting. It's always changing. Having a set of dogmas that you kind of are just relying on, this number of pillars that you aren't willing to shift or move or change with new, that seems more in line with a religion than like something related to science.
Yeah, I think you're tapping into something I think is really interesting and in many ways true of ecological psychologists. So one of my graduate school mentors, since I graduated, he said, he's been running reading groups on, ecological psychology literature. And they started referring to James Gibson as Saint Jimmy, right? And so they talk, St. Jimmy said, in his 1966 book, page 240,
right?
This sort of reverence.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So in that sense, I'm quite sympathetic to this view, right? But in another sense, I think it's not, and I'm not saying that you said it is a religion. You said it sounds like, a religion. But in the way that's not a religion is that really when it comes down to it, there's ecological psychology as a theory and ecological psychology as a science. And as a theory, right, Gibson theorizing from the armchair, right, like a philosopher might, an old school kind of philosopher might. What is perception? How do we define perception? Well, I'm going to define it in a way that it always has to be tied to action, and such and such. And then, so it becomes this kind of like, well, is it a good theory? Is it is it coherent with itself and its commitment? And that's kind of, that's more like a philosophical kind of work where you're assessing the strength of the argument and the theoretical consistency. But that wasn't enough, right? The theorizing then has to be cashed out with experiments, right? Can we test these things in the lab? Can we put this theory to the test? And ecological psychologists have been able to take that theory and test it empirically in the lab without needing to change those pillars, right? The question is, will there be too many anomalies that the ecological psychologists cannot handle, that they're going to have to change their theory? Some people think, well, ecological psychology is going to have to branch out. So I said earlier that there are some ecological psychologists who talk about ecological representations. Oh, Gibson would turn at his grave, right, if he heard that. But some people are like, well, it just seems like a matter of fact that there are some mental representations. Like ecological psychology will always be incomplete if it doesn't start including those things that are very real.
Right.
Imagination. I can close my eyes and I could still picture you.
Right. There's so many examples where there's just so much empirical evidence that the brain has to model some elements of the external world.
Right. And so some, ecological psychologists, we have to branch out. Other ecological psychologists will then do one of two things. They'll say, well, maybe we just hit the limits on what ecological psychology can explain, right? So some people have criticized ecological psychologists and said, well, you haven't explained the really interesting mental stuff, right? Imagination, mathematical, reason. An ecological psychologist can very justifiably say, and so what? That's not my goal. I'm not interested in explaining those things.
That's an interesting point. That's, an interesting point that theory in itself can be self-limiting, and that's fine. That doesn't, a single theory doesn't actually have to explain all processes. You can say you can say very rightly that it might explain this set of processes, but just because it doesn't explain these other ones doesn't actually disprove the first set. That's quite interesting. I hadn't really considered that. These things don't have to be a holistic idea of how everything in the brain works. It might be able to give some idea, or it might have some explanation for intelligence, but not consciousness. And just because it doesn't have that doesn't mean that it's any less valid on the other things. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing is another move some ecological psychologists make is reinterpreting what the opponents say ecological psychology is not explaining. So, for example, maybe like some super cognitive psychologist person who's heavily into computational representation says, how do you explain mathematics without computation representation? Well, actually, there's a lot of work on the embodied learning and processing of mathematics, right? So there's developmental work. When children learn how to count, they often use their body, right? I still do this. When I go to the grocery store, I'm like, how many bananas did I get? Right? I still do that. You know what I mean? And so there's a reshifting of the challenge, right? So the challenger to ecological psychologists might say, well, you're not explaining X. An ecological psychologist can say, well, what do you mean by X? You're building assumptions into what it takes to be X and to explain X. But actually, our pillars can still explain that if we think about it in this way.
Right.
So those are the three kind of ways of dealing with that.
So I think this is a good time to dive into your efforts to merge these two fields, which is I think you can say if this is wrong, but the overarching goal in the ecological brain is to set out a number of hypotheses that you think to be true under both sets of rules, sets of theories. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, let's say roughly correct. Yep.
Okay, so where is it not correct?
Yeah. So what I want to do is take seriously the challenge that ecological psychologists have not given a satisfactory account of the brain or nervous system in their story. And to take Gibson's points seriously that we are perceptual systems. I am a body in a world. Well, my body has stuff inside, like neurons and the nervous system. And the ecological psychologists they tend not to really deal with that. And that's fine for a lot of phenomena and the kind of explanation you want and different purposes. And, if you're designing, handles that afford grasping in an efficient way, you don't really need the nervous system. You just need to know the material and the body and stuff like that. But I want to take up the challenge and say, what is the nervous system? What is the brain contribution to the phenomena that Gibson and ecological psychologists are interested in studying? And so neuroscience, which is by definition the study of the nervous system and brain, has to be integrated with ecological psychology in order for ecological psychology to give a fuller story of what it's trying to explain.
Right.
When I said roughly, that's what I'm getting at, but without taking in a lot of the baggage that is common to neuroscience. So neuroscience, broadly speaking, is a study of the nervous system, but neuroscience also tends to be committed to pillars that ecological psychologists reject. So that's where the roughly part came in, right? So I want to integrate neuroscience, but without all the baggage.
That's useful to dive into a bit more. Like, what are those exact things within neuroscience that you don't want to do with when you're merging in with ecological psychology? Like, what is that baggage that you talk about?
Yeah, so it's easier to talk about ecological psychology, capital E, capital P. There's only one, right? And it goes to Gibson and his wife, and then there are big names like Michael Turvey and Bill Warren and people like that, right? There's a tradition there. Neuroscience is not that simple, right? You go to the Society for Neuroscience meeting, there's like 40,000 people there. And you go up and down the poster rows, and they're all studying different things from, genetics all the way up to, rodent behavior and all sorts of things like that. You've got people who are doing behavioral experiments, and you got people who are doing computational modeling. Yeah. So you can't just say like neuroscience writ large, right? So I'm talking more, more specific and limited sense of the neurosciences. So cognitive neuroscience, a lot of perceptual neuroscience, and a lot of computational neuroscience. So stuff like molecular, genetic neuroscience, not really too concerned with that specifically. So
Gotcha.
when I say I have a chapter in the book that says, the sins of cognitivism visited upon neuroscience, very, very epic, and talk about biblical. Now I'm going to be all self-conscious that every time I do any ecological work, I'm making it sound like biblical or something. So basically what I'm saying in that chapter is that these kinds of neurosciences that are most related or relevant to what ecological psychologists do, looking at the perceptual, the cognitive, the computational, I argue in the book, via historical, reasons, that they've inherited basically the theoretical apparatuses from cognitive psychology and cognitive science. So taken together, I call this cognitivism for short, and this is the idea that intelligent behavior, intelligent action, problem solving, all these things are brain-centered computations acting on representations. So they're either representations of the world or representations of ideas, words, quantities, things like that. And so the cognitive neuroscientist has taken the task, her task is to understand how the brain computes and how it utilizes representations and things like that. And that, to me, theoretically came from the cognitive psychologists and cognitive scientists. So those were the very things, though, that ecological psychologists were pushing against, the cognitivist commitments of cognitive science and cognitive psychology. Thus, if neuroscience is incorporating those commitments, then ecological psychologists is going to be, or ecological psychology will be critical of them as well.
Okay, so those are the areas. That makes sense. And neuroscience is a big catch-all term that describes a crazy amount of different things. And I think it is helpful that ecological psychology is very clear about it, saying we're this and we're not this. I mean, neuroscience can be a little bit too expansive and confusing at times in that way. So let's talk about your next theory. Let's go into really what you are laying out in the book.
Yeah. So, I'm taking seriously, again, the challenge of I want to maintain the core principles, the core pillars of ecological psychology. And there's four of them. There's, perception is direct. There's, affordances. There is the perception action loop. And then there is the organism environment system is the meaningful unit of investigation. So I want to biblically, stay committed to those, right? I want to see if I can not budge on those, right? And include the neuro aspect of that story. So what would it take? What would be the neuroscience or the neural scale, spatial or temporal scale contributions to events in the world that maintain those four principles? And so the Neuro-Ecological Nexus theory, or NEXT for short, is this idea of, well, what is the neuro contribution to ecological events?
Right.
And I'm calling it a theory. This is really important because, a scientific theory, and you started talking about this a little bit ago, a scientific theory needs to be revisable. It can be wrong. It can be falsifiable, right? There can be core aspects of it that are maintained, but it has to get cashed out in some way empirically. So, it's a theory. It's a scientific theory. It's not just a philosophical thesis, right? It has philosophical aspects, like that the external world really exists, that everything that exists is just physical, like stuff like that. I don't need to explicitly say that, but, those things are maintained as well. So it is a theory. And as a theory, I want to have hypotheses that are testable. So it's comprised of 6 hypotheses that should each be testable. And if any of them are wrong, well, then the theory needs to change.
Right.
And if they all end up being wrong, then I think we're going to have a tough time reconciling ecological psychology and neuroscience. That's not to say that I've got, the best theory or the only theory, but I'm giving a good faith effort to maintain ecological psychology and bring in the neuro story. And I think across these hypotheses, I try to do that. Thus, my inference is if those hypotheses can't do it, then that project is going to be really hard to pull off
Right.
until someone can provide something, better.
So some of my difficulty with it is that there's a few of these pillars in ecological psychology that I don't really understand why they're not directly conducive with neuroscience as it stands. So take affordances, because there's a lot of words that have, I think, meanings that are very specific here, where affordances describe that, because when I was reading about affordances, I didn't really understand what was uniquely cognitive psychology, neuroscience about that. Everything I read about, affordances specifically, I was like, yeah, that's in line with my current mental model, although I don't know if you have an issue with me saying mental model. I don't know if we have those in ecological psychology, but I was like, that's all completely fine. So what would, I guess, a cognitive psychologist have problem with in affordances?
Yes. There's a very kind of, loose, entry point into what affordances are. And it just means opportunities for action.
Right.
Right. So does the chair afford sitting on? Does the cup afford grasping? That's just the starting point, right? There's actually a deep metaphysics for Gibson in what affordances are. Affordances, he's got these sayings, and right now I'm like brain farting on what it is exactly, but essentially it's a very cryptic saying that gets quoted a lot by ecological psychologists and by critics as well, where Gibson says, affordances are subjective and objective, or neither, or both, right? It's a feature of the animal and the environment, or neither, or both, right?
What is
That
that?
on its own sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right? But in the context, of the chapter that he's writing, what he's getting at is that we need to break down dichotomous thinking. We need to break down the idea that organisms have an internal world and then there's an external world, but these are just, cut off from each other, right? There should, the better idea is to think of them as a mutually interacting. There's not really any in principle way to draw that line, right? I am not, as an organism, cut off from the world. I am part of the world. The world is part of me. If you want to say that there is no external world and internal world, fine, as long as you accept that there's that kind of mutuality of interaction and composition. Or you could say that, there is that distinction as long as that mutuality is constrained, or neither, right? Like, we want to fall into these dichotomies, and Gibson wants to push us to break those dichotomies down. So when we think about affordances, while we say there's opportunities for behavior, and we can talk about, does this cup afford grasping? It's really easy to say, well, because the cup is an object in the world, and I need to understand how it relates to me as a separate organism. But really, the cup exists as affording grasping metaphysically. Well, now I'm going to get into hot water with some ecological psychologists, but for the sake of this current conversation,
Get controversial.
Yeah, let's get controversial, as if the biblical stuff wasn't enough, right? So they'll say the affordance, it just doesn't exist unless the organism is there. And my hand just really is for nothing unless it's part of my body and part of an environment, right? And so, yeah, Gibson's asking us to dissolve the dichotomies, the subjective, the objective, to think about being in the world as a system that exists, right? And so an affordance has a deep metaphysics to it that I don't think the cognitive psychologist is taking on. I think that they are still drawing, this separation, right? Yeah, the cup affords grasping. But the cognitive psychologists, at least none that I've come across, and I'm not saying I've read all the literature, because there's an infinite amount of that literature, but they say I'm separate from my cup. The cup is not me. Like, when I think about child development, I don't include cups in that picture, right? It's like separate from the organism. But Gibson, the Gibsons, James Gibson and wife Eleanor, might say in some kind of real way, cups only exist in relation to the ability of a child to develop to be able to hold that cup, right? It doesn't afford holding if the child can't grasp it. It doesn't afford holding if it's, if you can't see it, right? If you don't even know that it's there. So this kind of mutuality between the organism and environment and affordances emerge at the scale of the organism environment system. That's a deep metaphysics that I don't think the cognitive psychologist is taking on board.
Right.
And another key part of affordances is the idea that affordances are specified by the structure of information in the environment. That's a super loaded statement I just gave you.
But it's a good sentence.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
It's a good sentence. Let's try and unpack it.
So when ecological psychologists talk about information,
yeah,
they're not talking about information in the way that cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists do. So cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists tend to talk about information in a few agreed upon ways. So there's things like Shannon-Weaver information. So something's informative depending on the degree of uncertainty, right? It's more informative if there's less uncertainty. There's also information in the sense of like data structures, right? Zeros and ones and what they encode and things like that. And so neurons spiking, right? The combination of spiking, is a kind of information, for the the mental, kind of the computational system, things like that. Information for the ecological psychologist is the energy in the environment. So the light that reflects, so it's more kind of physics based, right? So think about the way a physicist views the world. Photons, not necessarily, bouncing off of things from a light source, sound waves, olfaction, right? The molecules in the air that I smell. These are forms of information for the ecological psychologist. Organisms then are able to perceive something as affording whatever, graspability, pass-throughability, based on their ability to pick up and engage with that information in the environment. And so the structure of the information in the environment then specifies, it constrains what the organism can do, what the environment offers itself. And this is all perceptually detectable based on the specified structure of information or the constrained nature of environmental energy, to put it another way.
Right. That was well explained. There's a lot of things that I think, a lot of big questions I had coming in, and the dominoes are falling one by one. It's still a lot. But let's try and go to this one then. So if the argument is that, the information in the system of the organism and the environment is just a much better unit of discovery, or a unit of investigation, I guess, I think is the way that you phrased it. What are really good questions to ask that system? What are really good hypotheses, things to test in that system? And again, I come back to how would you measure it? How do you measure these very intangible energies between, humans and mugs and the environment and everything else? What are your actual measurement devices? Because those are still things that are quite unclear. Cognitive psychology, again, is very useful at being very specific about its recording equipment, what kind of, units and measurements you're going to get your data back in. It's not clear to me what units the data will be in these types of experiments. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there's, quite a wide range of experimental paradigms that fall within ecological psychology. And, one thing that the ecological psychologist really wants to stress and just to confuse things is the ecological validity of the experiment. And so ecological validity is not a ecological psychology phrase, right? This is just a common phrase for people doing experiments, right? And ecological validity means, in the short layperson's kind of way, is how realistic is the task to something in the real world, right? Remember, ecological psychologists really want to stress the validity of the experiment and say, this is something that real organisms deal with in the real world. And so, for example, I've done a series of experiments on the affordance of pass-throughability. And so my experiments involved constructing real apertures in the world that organisms have to deal with and that they would engage with in a realistic way. So it's the size of a real door people would deal with. It's a common kind of feature that people would engage with. Again, like the example I gave earlier, trying to get order a beer at the bar and you've got a couple of people in front of you, you got to pass through them. Right? The idea is to make your experiments as realistic as
Right.
possible. And that has the virtue of being more ecologically valid, but it has the challenge of also potentially introducing a lot of confounds and having a lot of variables that are harder to constrain.
Yeah.
The cognitive psychologist and the neuroscientist, you were just saying the cognitive psychologist, but the idea that, they can be really precise about what they're measuring and, specific variables that they're manipulating. Maybe.
But maybe not.
But also maybe not.
Yeah.
And how ecologically valid is it? So how much are we going to learn about visual perception, like real visual perception, like we are doing right now? Or when I go outside to take my, trash out to the trash can, or when I'm driving my car, how much am I going to learn about that by putting someone in a big magnetic tube,
Right,
and then constraining their head,
yeah,
right, and then having them lay there for 2 hours, and then presenting them 2D images of like a red square on a black background, and then clicking, a button.
right. I completely accept that. That's one of I think why I read that, and when you've been talking, that's sort of one of the strongest arguments that I really receive is just how how good is the data we're actually getting from neuroscience experiments? Because there you can talk about the whole replication crisis that's happened across psychology and neuroscience in terms of these experiments not really replicating, the power of these studies being really bad. That there is lots of methodological flaws with the way we're currently doing, you could call brain research in inverted commas, which is obviously a huge field. That makes a lot of sense to me. So again, with these aperture studies, you have people explain this system to me. Well, what is just a person in a room? They have an aperture, which is just a door. They're walking through it. What are you measuring?
Yeah. So, in this case, one more vivid cases I can give is I was interested in testing the hypothesis that there is, the information, ecological information in the environment, and it specifies the opportunity to pull off this task. And the task involves passing through an aperture. Thus, the task is about an organism environment system comprised of this aperture that was built and then the organism. And the organism is a perceptual system that can tap into that information in various ways. And so the hypothesis is asking, can different modalities tap into the ecological information in various ways that still facilitates the same affordance of pass-throughability? And so in this case, participants stood in front of an aperture of various widths. So they'd be presented with various openings. And then they were asked to make judgments about whether they thought they could pass through it or not. So they actually didn't walk through it.
Gotcha.
They were standing away from it. And the three modalities, one was vision. So they had to look around, and decide if they could pass through it. And then two haptic devices were used. So they were blindfolded and then had earmuffs. They used a cane. So they would use a cane to feel the aperture openings. And then they also used this device, a sensory substitution device, which is basically the size of a flashlight. And it sends a signal. And depending on how close you are to an object, the device sends a signal to a little motor on the wrist that then changes intensity. So if I get close to something, it vibrates more. If I get further from something, it vibrates less.
Right.
And so the idea is that, my body is my body. The aperture is the aperture in the world. And I'm interacting with, this structured information in these different ways. And it should be able to facilitate, the same kind of accuracy in my affordance judgments, right? Because it's the whole system that's involved. So whether I'm using vision or the cane is providing a different kind of proprioceptive information, right? As I tap on the wall, the different shape of my hand is giving the different sense of the structure, or the intensity, just the vibration on my wrist, right? This is another kind of haptic modality. And so this is kind of a comparative assessment of their judgments, where the judgments are then scaled by the aperture width ratio compared to their shoulder width ratio, and then also their action ratio. So after they made these judgments, they were asked to walk through the aperture, and then we measured how wide the aperture would have to be for them to walk through it. Because, I can walk through something that's smaller this way than I can if I'm kind of, going like that. It takes something wider. So, we measure the judgment of yes, I can pass through or not in relation to the body scaled, so my shoulder ratio to the aperture width, and the action scaled, my kind of walking width. And so these ratios were then compared to the judgments.
Right.
Pass through, no pass through. And so, we use some, standard kind of perceptual psychology assessments, the point of subjective equality. So if you think about this kind of standard graph that looks like an S, the point of subjective equality is the point at which something is, perceivable or not. And in this case, it's something that it affords or not. And so we use that. A perfect one in the point of subjective equality would mean that people made perfect judgments about what apertures they could walk through or not. Anything under that, they were under judging. So they might say they couldn't pass through something even though they could. Any number over one would be they were saying they could pass through something even when they couldn't.
Right.
So there's a lot of different things that are being measured and compared, and then you utilize your kind of standard descriptive statistics. So analyses of variance or ANOVAs, and you compare, this kind of 2x2 structure and the data analysis. And so then we can see how accurate are they, what can they actually pass through, and then how do those judgments compare across modalities.
Right.
And so that's just one kind of standard way of assessing.
That was a really clear example. Actually, that really helped me understand what this experimental paradigm might look like. What was the answer? Were you equally accurate across the different modalities? Because am I right in saying this is a brilliant test? Because am I right in saying that the predicted answer to this hypothesis is different in cognitive psychology and ecological psychology? Is that correct? Because I would suspect that if you expect equal accuracy across the modalities in ecological psychology, because it's the whole information system, whereas cognitive psychology would predict that vision modality would be most accurate, and then there'd be differences. So you would take this hypothesis would have a different answer based on, or the predicted answer would be different based on what test you run it through. So what was the answer? I'm dying to know now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in how you're assessing this difference. And I was pleasantly surprised, though maybe not surprised. I was expected. I was happy to see how it turned out. So they were, when comparing all three modalities, they were equally accurate. Yeah. And what's shocking, vision, and compare it, you take the two haptic modalities as one kind of variable that you're comparing with vision. The haptics were more accurate than the visual modalities. So they were actually able to make more accurate affordance judgments with the two haptic devices than they could with their vision.
Wow.
So that's really interesting. A further variable or thing that we measured where we also asked participants to give confidence ratings. So we use a standard Likert scale, 1 to 7, 1 not confident at all, 7 supremely confident. So they would say they'd have they'd close their eyes, we would shift the aperture and say, okay, go ahead and look. They would look, no, I can't pass through that. Confidence 1, I'm not very confident in that. So they did that with all their judgments. And what we ended up finding was that people were very confident with their vision judgments and not confident at all with their haptic judgments.
Right. Yeah. Which is what you would intuit as well.
Which you intuit as well, agreed. But yet the actual findings were opposite. So it's
that's a really good example, because this whole conversation I've really been digging for, like, where is one case where the testable hypothesis would have a different predictive answer between the two sets of, ideas. And that's a really good example. And I'm shocked that they were equally, the modalities were equally accurate. So what was your conclusion from that experiment? Like, what was the conclusion from it? How is your body in the entire information ecosystem of your brain, body, and aperture, which is the environment? How is it equally accurate across modalities? Or, what was your conclusion in that? Because, like, again, I'm thinking from a neuroscience perspective, you just got a lot more visual cortex than you do, like, those other modalities. So how could it not be the vision? I mean, we also do know that vision is very, inaccurate in lots of ways. Like facial recognition in, things like crime is very inaccurate, but we at least have more processing there. So I would still expect, looking at an aperture, that chunk of visual cortex has got to be more accurate than the other modalities. So what was your conclusion there in why how did you conclude that experiment?
Well, so the interpretation of the results is that we are, here's another term we got thrown in, we're soft assembled perceptual systems.
Okay.
What does that mean? What that means, a soft assembled system means that it's not rigidly organized, that it can reorganize based on tasks. So what we do as organisms is we want to tap into the ecological information any way we can to pull off an end, to carry out intelligent behavior, to conduct a task. And we will just, like a tongue, we just want to taste the information in the world in any way we can. And so we do it as a whole body. We will use whatever we can to get that information. And so part of the interpretation of the results is, well, if affordances are full organism environment, if they're facilitated, if they are contributed by full organism embodied system, then if you take away vision, we're just going to find another way to get it to tap into the world, right? And so this is why we controlled for hearing as well, because other experiments have shown that people would, they lose their vision experimentally, and they use, canes, they will, tap on the sound. They'll use the echo vibrations to inform them about the width and opening of apertures and other kinds of affordances. So a couple of, theoretical conclusions, interpretations are: one, action capabilities, how we act in the world is going to be informed by this full system, right? And two, we are soft assembled kinds of organisms to a certain degree, right? I'm not going to be able to pull my thumb off and put it on my forehead, right?
But explain that a little bit more, the soft assembled, because again, when I think of that, I think neuroscience perspective, he's talking about neuroplasticity. The neurons are rewiring, but I don't think that's what you mean by soft assembled. Well, or maybe partially.
That'll be part of it, right?
Part of it.
Yeah. So, for example, when people, lose vision for whatever reason, those parts of the brain will end up getting recruited, right? Or integrated with other modalities, as well. So there are these studies about, so when we read, certain parts of the brain, have been recorded to light up. People lose their vision. The haptic parts, so when people start reading, with Braille, right, the haptic parts start, recruiting from the visual parts of the brain. So in that way, that's also a neuro version of the soft assembly,
right?
Kind of approach too. So that intuition is right. So, different kinds of studies in experimental psychology have tried to illuminate the nature of the soft assembly. So they'll do things like constrain movements in one way to see how we compensate in others. So, for example, we might, there are this funny studies of putting people in pipes where they move their arms, but then they're supposed to grab something, and then they end up being able to compensate. Even speech, there's been some studies where, the ability to speak, it requires a lot of muscles, right? My lips moving, my tongue moving, the sound coming out. There were some studies done where they sewed these people's mouths closed at the jaws, And then they had them, pronounce various kinds of syllables, and very quickly people were able to compensate with, whereas they might have to say something like ba ba ba, and then they close their mouth, bo bo bo. You're able to make that, but now now I have to be focused more on my lower lip. I'm adapting to, because my speech system, if you will, is soft assembled.
Is that not all neurons? Like, my intuition is that all of those examples are just all neurons. What's not neurons in that adaptability? If you see, because you know what I mean? All those examples seem to me that they like those are examples of neuronal adaptability. Where's the rest of the non-neuronal adaptability?
So let me pull an Aikido move and turn your energy against you and ask you, how is that all neurons?
It's just I guess it's my intuition. It's my bias in neuroscience is that adaptability is a result of, synaptic changes in the brain that is changing circuits on some level. And, like any sort of mouth movement is just, circuits in the motor cortex that is moving the mouth. Any sort of language production is circuits in the language centers in the brain. And any changes in those things is neuronal adaptability, is neurons shifting around, changing their synapses, circuits operating differently, neuromodulators like serotonin and dopamine, changing the way that those circuits operate and flow. That's, for me, ultimately, I guess it's a reductionist perspective, is it kind of funnels down to neurons at the end. I'm really curious, like, what's the, yeah.
So let's say, okay, so when I'm talking and I'm saying ba ba ba, you're saying that the neuro story is, well, there are certain kind of neural networks involved that are, telling my mouth to move in a certain way and telling my vocal cords to do a certain something, and I'm breathing out the air in a certain way, and that's all the neurons telling it to do that.
Yeah,
So,
consciously or subconsciously, yeah.
Yeah. So when I stitch my mouth closed, and then I go bo bo bo, it's the neurons that are now telling my mouth to move differently. Because my neurons haven't changed. It's the body that's changed. So why would we say that it's the neurons that are primarily explanatory in that phenomenon? It would seem that the body has changed and is now going back to the neurons. If there's any primacy in the causal direction, it seems it's from the body to the brain.
Right.
The brain has to adapt.
I would agree with that.
What the body is like.
Yeah. Like it's always bi-directional, right? I mean, the initial signal is going to be, I think, you're trying to produce speech. Oh, there's something strangely wrong here. My mouth won't open for some reason. That's the stitches. That signal goes back up to the neurons again. And, you'd probably do that loop. I don't know how you might do it thousands of times. I have no idea, right? But there's some information flow between like the motor neurons in your mouth and the neurons in different areas of your brain and the circuits. But eventually the causal change or the causal adaptability is brain first, is what my neuroscience dogma intuition bias is, telling me without really knowing the answer, right?
Yeah. So will there be corresponding brain neural activity when you change the body? Yeah. Is that going to be what's causally relevant? Well, you were talking about, neurons, muscle, motor neurons, and there's neurons in the body, and the neurons in the heart, and neurons in the gut, right? And so are those what's driving the behavior, or do you want to just go straight to the brain, that the brain is the command center, right? It seems that the body can do things in a pretty fast way, like catching a ball or something, faster than the signal can go. And that's because even neurally, the intelligence, I'm using that loosely, is distributed in the body. And so eventually you might have to change what's happening in the brain. But where, again, the causal, primacy, if there has to be one, the directionality, where is it happening first? And as someone who's a proponent of embodied approaches and situated approaches, I'd say, well, it's the body that's first, and then the brain has to catch up. One of my, to illustrate this point a little bit more, one of my professors in graduate school, Guy Van Orden, who passed away a few years ago, he had this paper called The Blue Collar Brain.
Okay.
And he said, well, the standard view is that the brain is a white collar executive, right? That tells the body what to do, that makes the final decisions, that receives the information and has to process it and stuff. And so he gives various kinds of physiological motivations for saying that actually the brain is, to use a term that's a little bit unfortunate, but the brain is enslaved to the body. So the time scales of the body are more important causally to a lot of phenomena than the time scales of the brain. So although the brain, spikes are happening on millisecond scale, and my movements are happening at the second scale, the brain activity will actually have to adjust to those slower time scales more than the slower time scales adjust to the faster time scales. So the brain is doing something really important, right? It might be like the center where everything's kind of coming together and flowing. So the thalamus is thought of as being, one of those kind of junction areas in the brain. But the brain itself might be in kind of the thalamus of the body. I'm going to use that loose. I've never said that before, but maybe that works. And so the body then has to set the conditions that the brain has to abide by.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there are various, again, like I say, he gives these very kind of physiological reasons. And so coming back to the story of the pronunciation, there's a certain time scale at which my speaking happens. There's certain time scales at which my neural activity is happening. When I change my body, now those time scales are going to have to adapt to these new time scales that are happening in the body. So that's why I would say, causally, it is bidirectional, as you said, right? It's going both ways. But if we had to carve it out, we had to say one is more primary than the other. I'd say the body's time scales, the environment's time scales are what enslave or constrain the neural time scales.
Interesting. I don't have any problem with thinking about the brain and body much more as a singular unit than just them with a huge wall in the middle. Like recently I've even found myself, talking to people, and people say, prioritizing your physical health or your mental health. And, as time goes on, I fail to see how they actually really divide, and there isn't so much of a wall between them. It is just one really complicated system. If I were to give you 10 million euro and you could do ecological psychology research, what is like a really cool big experiment that you would do where, obviously money is no issue, but like, what's a really interesting question that you want to ask, and if you had the money and time that you could execute on it? I'm really curious. Like, you must have something in there that is just maybe preposterous money wise or technology wise even, and invent some technology if you want. Because I'm only talking purely theoretically here, because I'm just curious. Like, what are the really big questions you would ask that?
Yeah. So what I have been interested, so someone who's interested in the neuro part of the story of what ecological psychologists are talking about, what I would want is these mobile neuro recording devices.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to record brain activity while people are moving. And
like Neuralink?
Well, Neuralink is, we could talk about Neuralink.
Yeah.
But, I'm thinking so there are some things called like FNIRS, FNIRS, and it's like functional neuro infrared something or other. But it can, it's a kind of mobile neuro recording device that you can put on the floor, and it'll, with infrared sensors, measure blood flow in the brain.
Ooh, I haven't heard of that.
Now using these while they do tests, so they can walk around and do things. There's also an increase in mobile EEG. So EEG was kind of, for maybe listeners who don't know, these caps that have little sensors and they record electrical activity from the surface. But the idea is that you can record deeper kind of neural activity. And the point is it records neural activity from the brain. It used to be very sensitive, this equipment. So people would have to be like, immobilized, because you wouldn't want to move at all. But now they're having these really cool EEG systems that people can actually move a bit more, and it's not going to mess up the signal. So with my 10 million euros, I would want to obtain and or develop more sophisticated neural recording devices and have participants wear them while they're doing affordance tasks. What those kind of connections are between that activity. Because again, I totally agree with you. There is a bidirectionality The brain is very important. I just don't stress that the brain is the most important, but I do want to know that's a part of the story that I think ecological psychologists would just be better served to fill in that part of the story. And that's the kind of experimental work that I would want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I add one thing?
Please.
Yeah. So I'm very happy, been informing, announcing people that I just started a new job at Indiana University, Bloomington.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm really happy. I'm split between two departments or programs. So I'm in history and philosophy of science, 50%. The other 50% is in cognitive science. And so I'm starting a new lab. And with some of my startup funding, I'm going to be obtaining motion tracking equipment. So there'll be cameras to measure the movement of bodies. But I'm also getting mobile eye tracking equipment. So when I did those experiments earlier that I talked to you about with the aperture studies, I didn't have anything to record eye movement.
Right.
And so now I'm going to be able to record the eye movement while people are doing these tasks. And eye movement, I think, is really interesting and has a deep, intimate connection with what the brain is doing, because eyes are part of the brain, right?
Yeah.
The optic nerve, is directly coming out of the eyes. So there's a really cool amount of things we can learn by looking at how eyes are moving, pupil dilation, oscillations, things like that during affordance tasks. And that hasn't been done very much. I'm lucky. I'm coming up. I'm developing this lab while this mobile eye tracking is getting more sophisticated and cheaper. So I'm going to be able to do a little bit of that dream work. I'm starting to kind of get at it, but I don't have 10 million euros, so I'm not going to be able to do the really super cool, mobile stuff. But maybe one day.
That's so cool. I'm excited for you because that sounds very, very exciting and very interesting. One of the things that leapt out to me when I started looking into ecological psychology, and as you talked, is that experimentation in that field does seem to be quite limited by the technology that is available. Because, as you said, things are quite clunky. Basically, the more measuring techniques and measuring interventions you put into the system, the less natural it is, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. Sticking your head in, as you say, into an MRI scanner, is that really mimicking anything in the real world? It's hard to know. We just can't actually ever say conclusively. So I think it's very exciting to see what technology will develop over the next 10 years, and then what greater experiments we'll be able to conduct where we can get a better sense of how the brain, body, and environment interact together. Because I think, this is really the first time in history where these experiments are possible, right? If you go back to the 80s, 90s, like what, physical experiments could you really do that weren't very clunky, that weren't going to, tarnish the results in some way? Because again, it's removing yourself from that natural environment. So it's very exciting. I'm excited for you. I'm going to be looking out for your papers. I hope to do a video about, research that you do in this new lab in the future. This has been so much fun. I've honestly learned so much. It's a whole area of neuroscience that has really been opened up to me, or psychology and brain and mind, consciousness, any language label that you want to put on it. The reason I do this podcast is because I can learn, and so I can learn. So I think it's incredible. I'll leave you with one final question. So this is the one that I like to ask every guest, and I really have enjoyed this so much. The next decade in neuroscience, psychology, consciousness, again, lump them all together, brain stuff, and then just put everything you want under that. What are you most excited about next decade, next 10 years? And then the inverse of that is, what are you most scared of?
Yeah. So what's been really exciting is there's been some recent work published showing that there are many more kinds of cells in the brain, like exponentially more than we thought there were.
Right.
And this is just really cool because we're learning that there are not just different kinds of neurons, there are just different kinds of cells altogether. And so I'm excited to see if there's going to be, one, identifying those cells in more detail, and two, how they interact with neurons, and three, how important neurons will continue to be or not. It'd be really interesting to see, because, there are more glial cells. It's like 10 to 1 glial cells to neurons. And I mean, it would be really interesting if, in 10, 20, 30 years, neuroscience textbooks shift the priority to glial cells or some unknown cell away from neuron. That'd be really, really kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Related to that, what scares me, um, from my own kind of, theoretical commitments and interests, is a continued focus on understanding thinking, cognition, behavior, consciousness in the same ways that we have, which is a brain-centric kind of way, and then so we've got a brain-centric way, and then brains are then neuron-centric, right? And so what scares me is that we're going to stay, and there's going to be a stalemate because people are going to hold with a death grip that things have to be explained by the brain, that the brain has to be explained by neurons, and that these have to be explained in terms of computations. I think we can do better.
Right.
And I'm scared that we're not going to grow beyond that. The idea of this computer paradigm, throughout human history and discovery, it's only like 70 years old, right? So I'm curious to see like where it's going to go. I mean, there's already been a loosening going from strict formal computations to more kind of network processing. That's a huge leap as well. So I'm scared to see no more leaps, and I'm excited to see new features of the brain being discovered.
Right. A really interesting answer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Tony Zador. He's a computational neuroscientist. So he fundamentally, he's a big proponent of, neurons are the powerhouses of the cell, that computation is everything. Neurons do that computation. And I asked him what he thought of the results. There was a really high resolution brain modeling that happened a couple of months ago that showed that outnumbering of glial cells to neurons. And I was curious what he thought about that. And if he thought, neurons were the centerpiece, the center star of neuroscience, simply because we developed technology to record their activity before anything else, which I think is a reasonable argument. We developed EEGs in the 80s, 90s, and that allowed us to read neuron activity, but we just simply didn't have technology to read all the rest of the brain. He said, glial are great. They might have a bigger role than we understand, but they're support. His idea was they're still support. They don't play a role in consciousness. They're the water boys. They're there to make sure the metabolic process of the neurons can run. But who knows? I mean, who knows? I just thought that was interesting, and I really like your balanced opinion as well. I mean, that's why I love talking to everyone that's studying all the different areas of the brain and the nervous system and everything else. So I thought that was really interesting. Louis, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've had so much fun. I don't think I've ever learned more on a podcast, which I think is actually the ultimate compliment I can give. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone should go read The Ecological Brain. It is genuinely very, very fascinating. It presents a very new idea about mind, body, brain interactions, and I think a lot of people might be familiar with. Even if you've studied neuroscience psychology formally, it offers very new schemas and frameworks for thinking about these things, and that's always very helpful. So this has been such a pleasure, Louis. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and the great questions. Really, really enjoyed that. It was fun.